These visions of the outrages offered to Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament I saw multiplied by innumerable church wardens who were totally deficient in their sense of equity, who failed to share at least what they had with their Redeemer present upon the altar, although he had delivered himself to death for them, although he remains for them hidden in the sacrament. Even the poorest creatures are often better off than the Lord of heaven and earth in his churches. Ah, how deeply did the inhospitality of men trouble Jesus, who had given himself to them as food. Truly, riches are not necessary to entertain him who rewards 1,000-fold the glass of cold water given to the thirsty. And how great is his thirst for us! Ought he not to complain when water swarming with worms is offered him in impure glasses? By such neglect, I saw the weak scandalized, the sanctuary profaned, the churches abandoned, the ministers of religion despised. This state of impurity and negligence sometimes extended even to the souls of the faithful. They kept not the tabernacle of their hearts purer to receive therein the living God than was the tabernacle of the altar. For the fawning eye service of princes and lords of the world, and to indulge their caprice and worldly designs, I saw every means carefully and actively resorted to by these unenlightened ecclesiastics, while the King of heaven and earth lay like another Lazarus outside the gate, vainly sighing after the crumbs of love denied him. He has nothing but the wounds which we have inflicted upon him and which the dogs lick, namely, ever-relapsing sinners who like dogs vomit and return to their food. Were I to talk a whole year, it would not suffice to recount the different outrages committed against Jesus Christ and the Blessed Sacrament made known to me in this way. I saw the offenders in immense crowds with weapons corresponding to the species of crime perpetrated by them, assaulting the Lord and striking him to the ground. I saw irreverent sacristans of all centuries, light-minded, sinful, worthless priests offering the holy sacrifice and distributing the Blessed Sacrament, and multitudes of tepid and unworthy communicants. I saw countless numbers to whom the source of all blessing, the mystery of the living God, had become an oath or a curse expressive of anger, and furious soldiers and servants of the devil who profaned the sacred vessels, who threw away the most blessed sacrament, who horribly outraged it, or who dishonored it in their frightful, hellish worship of false gods. Side by side with these hideous, barbarous cruelties, I saw innumerable other forms of godlessness more refined and subtle, but not less atrocious. I saw many souls, owing to bad example and perfidious teachers, losing their faith in Jesus' promises to remain always in the Blessed Sacrament, and no longer humbly adoring their Savior therein present. I saw in this multitude a great many sinful teachers who became teachers of error. They first struggled against one another, and then united against Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament of his Church. I saw a great crowd of these apostate heresiarchs disdainfully rejecting the priesthood of the Church, attacking and denying Jesus Christ's presence in the mystery of the Blessed Sacrament in the manner in which he himself gave this mystery to the Church, which has truly preserved it. By their seductive words, they tore from the heart of Jesus countless numbers for whom he had shed his blood. Ah! It was fearful to look upon. For I saw the Church as the body of Jesus, its scattered members all knitted together by him in his bitter passion. I saw all those people, all those families, with their descendants that he had separated from the Church, torn away from Jesus like entire pieces mangled and most painfully rent from his living flesh. Ah! He glanced at them so pitifully, he moaned so gently. He who, in order to unite to the body of his Church, to the body of his bride, men so separated, so divided from one another, had given himself in the Blessed Sacrament to be their food, saw himself in this, his bride's body, torn and lacerated through the wicked fruit of the tree of disunion. The table of union in the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus' highest work of love, that in which he willed to remain forever among men, became through false teachers the boundary line of separation. And where alone it is good and beneficial that many should become one, namely, at the holy table, wherein the living God is himself the food, there must his children separate from infidels and heretics in order not to render themselves guilty of similar sins. I saw whole nations torn in this way from the heart of Jesus and deprived of participation in the treasures of grace left to the Church. It was frightful to behold how at first only a few separated from Christ's Church. And when, having increased to whole nations, they returned to her, They again attacked her and warred against one another on the question of what was holiest in her worship, namely, the Blessed Sacrament. But finally, I saw all who had separated from the church plunging into infidelity, superstition, heresy, darkness, and the false philosophy of the world. Perplexed and enraged, they united in large bodies to vent their anger against the church. They were urged on and destroyed by the serpent in the midst of them. Ah! It was as if Jesus felt himself torn into countless shreds. The Lord saw and felt in this distressing vision the whole weight of the poisonous tree of disunion with all its branches and fruits, which will continue to rend itself asunder until the end of time, when the wheat will be gathered into the barn and the chaff cast into the fire. The terror that I felt in beholding all this was so great, so dreadful, that my heavenly bridegroom appeared to me, and mercifully laying his hand on my breast, he said, "No one has ever before seen these things, and thy heart would break with fright, did I not sustain it." I now saw the blood and thick, dark drops trickling down the pale face of the Lord. His once smoothly parted hair was matted with blood, tangled and bristling on his head, and his beard was bloody and torn. It was after that last vision, in which the armed bands had lacerated his flesh, that he turned as if fleeing out of the grotto, and went again to his disciples. But his step was far from secure. He walked bowed like one tottering under a great burden. He was covered with wounds, and he fell at every step. When he reached the 3 apostles, he did not, as on the first occasion, find them lying on their side asleep. They had sunk back on their knees with covered head, as I have often seen the people of that country sitting when in sorrow or in prayer. Worn out with grief, anxiety, and fatigue, they had fallen asleep. But when Jesus approached, trembling and groaning, they awoke. They gazed upon him with their weary eyes, but did not at once recognize him, for he was changed beyond the power of words to express. He was standing before them in the moonlight, his breast sunken, his form bent, his face pale and blood-stained, his hair in disorder, and his arms stretched out to them. He stood wringing his hands. The apostles sprang up, grasped him under the arms, and supported him tenderly. Then he spoke to them in deep affliction. On the morrow, he said, he was going to die. In another hour, his enemies would seize him, drag him before the courts of justice, abuse him, deride him, scourge him, and put him to death in the most horrible manner. He begged them to console his mother. He recounted to them in bitter anguish all that he would have to suffer until the evening of the next day, and again begged them to comfort his mother and Magdalene. He stood thus speaking for some moments, but the apostles kept silence, not knowing what to reply. They were so filled with grief and consternation at his words and appearance that they knew not what to say. Indeed, they even thought that his mind was wandering. When he wanted to return to the grotto, he had not the power to do so. I saw that John and James had to lead him. When he entered it, the apostles left him and went back to their own place. It was then 11:15. During this agony of Jesus, I saw the Blessed Virgin overwhelmed with sorrow and anguish in the house of Mary Marcus. She was with Magdalene and Mary Marcus in a garden adjoining the house. She had sunk on her knees on a stone slab. She was perfectly absorbed in her own interior, quite diverted in thought from everything around her, seeing only, feeling only the sufferings of her divine Son. She had sent messengers to obtain news of him, but unable to await their coming, in her anguish of heart she went with Magdalene and Salome out into the valley of Josaphat. I saw her walking along veiled, her arms often outstretched toward the Mount of Olives, where she saw in spirit Jesus agonizing and sweating blood. It seemed as if she would with her outstretched hands wipe his sacred face. In answer to these interior and vehement movements of her soul toward her Son, I saw that Jesus was stirred with thoughts of her. He turned his eyes in her direction as if seeking help from her. I saw this mutual sympathy under the appearance of rays of light passing to and fro between them. The Lord thought also of Magdalene and felt for her in her distress. He glanced toward her, and his soul was touched at sight of her. He therefore ordered the disciples to console her, for he knew that her love for him, after that of his mother, was greater than that of anyone else. He saw what she would have to suffer for him in the future, and also that she would never more offend him. About this time, perhaps 11:15, The 8 apostles were again in the arbor in the Garden of Gethsemane. They spoke together for a while and then fell asleep. They were unusually faint-hearted, discouraged, and in sore temptation. Each had been looking out for a place of safety and anxiously asking, "What shall we do when he is dead? We have abandoned our friends, we have given up everything, we have become poor and objects of scorn to the world, we have devoted ourselves entirely to his service, and now, behold him crushed and helpless, with power to afford us no consolation." The other disciples, after wandering about in various directions and hearing the reports of the awful prophecies to which Jesus had given utterance, nearly all retired to Bethpage,